Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2. Give yourselves a hand. We're halfway up the hill, like Sisyphus. Everybody know the myth of Sisyphus? Anybody not familiar with the myth of Sisyphus? Some takers. Well, as with virtually everything in Greek mythology, there's always layers of understanding and meaning. It's a Greek myth. It's called Sisyphus. There's a guy named Sisyphus. I forget what he did. I don't know. He played around with Zeus's mistress or something, and he was sentenced to a fate. His fate was that he had to push a big boulder up a hill or a mountain, and he had to push it up, get it to the top, and right at the top it would always roll down. Does that sound familiar? Okay. That's in Greek mythology, it's called being bound to your fate, okay, as opposed to being able to embody and manifest and express your destiny, meaning who you are. Your fate is your pre-programmed life, what my wife and I fondly call the redundant universe. We keep on trying to get over the hill, and it keeps repeating. There's another very interesting Greek myth story called Prometheus. Anybody not familiar with Prometheus? Okay. Prometheus dared to go up to the sky and attempt to take the fire that belonged to the gods, which means, the life force energy from the sun. For those of you who did not attend class yesterday, the whole name of the game is the cult of Aton, originating back in Egypt period with Akhenaten and various other players, and the cult of the sun. Basically, everything's built around the sun. All of our religions, all of our symbols, corporate logos, etc. So Prometheus dared to attempt to get the fire from the sun and bring it back to the earth and share it with the mortals. Same thing, variation on the theme. Rising above our crucified, bound life of fate at the mercy of the gods, and having our own capacity to be capable of manifesting who we really are. So in punishment for him, he was bound and lashed to a rock and eternally had his liver pecked out by carrion birds. Anybody want to guess who is in Rockefeller Square? There's a sculpture, brass, metal, whatever it is, called Prometheus Bound, okay? Which is basically our friends, the elite, the illumined ones, their overriding symbol, which is binding humanity to their fate so that their liver is continually pecked out by carrion birds of their own, of their own making. So that's basically part of the theme of things, is having our life force. Essentially, that is the theme. We all think, oh, they're really greedy, they want more money, they want this, they want that, whatever. No, ultimately it is binding us like Prometheus so that they can feed off of our life force, okay? Because we are creators, and they essentially have forgotten that they're creators, and they're basically living as parasites, foisting upon us, and us accepting the illusion of that we are incapable of being our own masters. So where do we want to go from here? Any questions from yesterday? Oh, I knew that was going to happen. Yes, sir.
What in the world did they expect to gain from this? I mean, if they made a deal for eternal life and luxury, maybe that was a good deal. But if you get anything less, I think they...
Okay, well, ultimately there is no they, okay? From my point of view, we are all in it together.
Yes.
There are those who accepted the role of being the masters or the middle management players. They're as bound and enslaved in this system as we are at this point, especially at this point, because as we will discuss later in the day, now, wouldn't necessarily call it payback, but let's just say it's time for calling the cows home. Everybody is going to face the consequences of their own manifested reality, their manifested consequences, whatever we have created. Somebody this morning asked about karma. Is there karma? Not in the way it's been taught like traditionally, but we are responsible for everything we create, and we're responsible for everything that we have accepted and allowed to be created. So we're all in it together, okay? In fact, I have a surprise for Miss Barbara. She asked for the punchline. Okay, she said, all right, I want the punchline. I've got the punchline for you, Barbara.
Great.
This is it.
Just way out.
Okay?
I like that.
Oh, you want a picture?
Yeah.
The only way out is in. We all have to face ourselves, and it's going to be more intense than you ever expected or imagined. But we'll get to that part later. So, when Vivian and or Jason are both asked about karma and a similar question, what was the Beni, that they, the pharaohs, the kings, the overlords, etc., what were they aiming at? When you read the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it basically boils down to you got to go through all these rites and rituals and processes through the post-death process to qualify to get to be hanging out with the gods, to be one with the gods. And again, later on, there's some more punchlines coming. It is more literal and true than you might imagine. And so those beings who played the program and went along with the program to be the overlords and the slave masters and everything else got to play the gods in heaven, okay, and or other things. And again, we will get to that later, but as I said, the human race has been directed to accept the illusion of building our own prison, and then some get to be prison wardens, some get to be prison guards, some get to be, the cashiers at the prison to gather in the money, and a lot get to be the inmates. But we're all in prison. But we built it, we created it. There's nothing outside of ourselves. Maybe Anu took advantage of creating certain things that predisposed the direction of humanity to keep creating it, but we created it, okay? And again, I'm going to go into that more later, but in the meantime, let's focus on where we left off historically. We were in the neighborhood of the 1600s. Between the 12 and 1600s, basically the Templars and the Venetian oligarchy up in the Netherlands and other key players were building the basic foundation and infrastructure of what became the modern banking system. Interestingly, one of the principal houses in the banking and royal system that was established in the Netherlands became known as the House of Orange. We talked about red being the frequency of the root chakra, and the Rothschilds having the red shield. Then we have the other component of the banking becoming the House of Orange, which is the frequency color of the second chakra. So they're covering both chakras. The House of Orange took over the throne of England in 1689, and basically their reward, in conjunction with other players, was founding the Bank of England, which I'll get to in a moment. But basically, so the banking infrastructure was being implemented and put in place during the 300-400 years between the 1200s, the 1600s. The Templars were seemingly lambasted and dispersed in 1307. That's a long story that we don't have time for. But it basically happened on October 13th, which was a Friday, so we have Friday the 13th as that's where that started. But the Templar fleet escaped and went up to the northern British Isles and in the area of Scotland. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, the Sinclairs took over and built Rosslyn Chapel, where a lot of the esoteric symbology, including our friends, the two pillars, and many other things, were built into that. A lot of what the Templars liked to do was build into stone the symbology and the imagery and everything else. If you go to the cathedrals in Europe, and have a decoder ring, you see all kinds of interesting things above and beyond the, the external trappings of the Catholic images and structure. But they also went over to America. Rosslyn Chapel was built in 1450 something, and it has in stone images that are from plants that only existed in America at the time. So, this illusion that Columbus went and found it in 1492 is another revisionist part of history. And as I said, also, the two twin sons of Cleopatra ended up in America in about 37, 35 BC. And my friends who I mentioned yesterday who did all that research, and I mentioned Harry and George. Well, Harry had a partner who was a linguist, and he spoke or read like 35 languages, and he knew like archaic Latin and ancient Etruscan and all these languages, and Algonquin, which is one of the base languages of the native nations in America. And he analyzed the nations, and sure enough, a lot of the roots in Algonquin are the same roots as Etruscan and archaic Latin and so forth. That's just a totally fascinating story. So the American Indians, basically that blows the doctrine of discovery out of the water in 1493, that the Pope issued this papal bull. He forgot the second word, but or they forgot to add the second word, but bull it is nonetheless. In 1493, basically saying any Christian flag that is planted on any land not previously claimed by another Christian sovereign belongs to that flag, and ultimately, of course, belongs to him. And so that's known as the doctrine of discovery. That gave them their ostensible justification for claiming all the Americas and every place else that in the next several hundred years became colonized by the Western European forces. But, technically speaking, the Europeans, the Egyptians, the Ptolemaic dynasty, and some aspects of Romans were here in 35 BC. So there's certainly some evidence to suggest that the Europeans were here 1,500 years before Columbus showed up. Be that as it may, another very key event, both physically, geopolitically, the whole unfolding story, but also esoterically and energetically, started happening in the early 1500s. It goes back to our story about gold, the mana of the gods. And when you read the Sitchin stories, historical Sumerian text about the Anunnaki, it's all about upgrading the genetics of the proto-human strains and turning them into workers. Who here is familiar with Sitchin's work? A little bit. Most of you are not. Okay. All right. As I mentioned yesterday, I think most of you may already know that Zecharia Sitchin did a lot of work in translating Sumerian texts and came out with a lot of books. One series called The Earth Chronicles, starting with the 12th planet about Nibiru and all the rest of it. There has subsequently been a lot of counter research saying that a lot of his interpretations and translations just were not really that accurate. But nonetheless, as I said yesterday, in my opinion, regardless of if he was off, misaligned with some of the elements of it and or he was just translating relatively accurately, the fact is he was just translating what the historical record was being inserted or implanted to be brought out now. To me, there's no accident about any of this stuff, the timing of when it comes out, because we are all bound like Prometheus and Sisyphus to our fate to show up at a pre-programmed time to play the role that we're designed to do, whatever that role may be. So Zecharia Sitchin's was to bring all this Sumerian stuff about the Anunnaki and the gods and the upgrade of the genetics. It's obviously true that the human race has been periodically upgraded genetically. You know, the story of Cro-Magnon man showing up 35,000 years ago, taking Homo sapiens from Homo sapien to Homo sapiens sapien with a higher neocortex capacity to think and all the rest of that. But the question is, who were the geneticists? Were they the Anunnaki? Were the Syrians, the Orions, or all the above? In a lot of ways, it's interesting, but in other ways, sort of irrelevant or immaterial. The fact is, we are who we are at this point, and the bottom line is, how do we become free? Most people, in my estimation, think that just having money is going to make us free. No, there's a lot more to it than just that. It will help. It'll make our imprisonment easier if we have money, but we're still in prison. And so later in the day, I'm going to talk about what is the exit strategy. But back to the Sumerians and the storyline, basically it's about gold. You know, the Anunnaki want us to be harvesting the gold. And if you look at the money system and how it always evolves, it goes usually from gold as a substance that has ability to be standardized, standard weights and measures and all the rest of it, and progressively is removed. You know, first it's gold in and of itself as coinage, then it's gold in warehousing represented by warehouse receipts, then it's just the warehouse receipts, and then it's fractional gold against warehouse receipts, and then it's just pieces of paper. In Egypt, those instruments of monetary units were what are found everywhere, all throughout Egypt, that Egyptologists tell us were their sacred little items of worship called scarabs. You know, okay, but the scarabs were their units of measure. Okay, so it started with the gold, and then it moved to the scarabs, and then eventually it's just, I'll pay you one scarab. I don't want that worthless scarab. It's the same thing, you know. It's the bait and switch, but it's always about the gold. Okay. And one aspect of it, of course, is what we talked about yesterday, that monoatomic gold has that capacity to lift one up to the planes of Charon, the planes of light, where that pre-programmed complete template of the end game point has been pre-written from the beginning. And as I said yesterday, though, that is not where we want to go. And a lot of people in the New Age metaphysical world, where the rediscovery of monoatomic elements and so forth. If you just do a Google search on monoatomic elements, or ORME, you'll see a lot of people producing some variation of it and thinking this is the way. Okay, but it's not the way, because where it was lifted up, that plane of Charon, or the plane of light, where the elite and the Illuminati and so forth were finding the pieces of the puzzle that it was theirs at their time and place to download and manifest. It's just another realm of the mind, another realm of the entrapment of the mind consciousness system.
Still part of the prison.
Right, exactly. But nonetheless, gold plays that central role. So the point I want to make here is bringing this up to the historical time frame leading into the 1500s, 1600s. We have the so-called discovery of America in 1492, the doctrine of discovery 1493, and the beginning of the moving out of the conquistadors and the European forces, scrambling from this little area right here to colonize all of this, basically. It's quite incredible to think this little area right here, that little area could control all of this, all of this, all of this, and all of this. And sometimes this.
What do you think it was, Ken? You think it was the fact that Marco Polo brought gunpowder back to Italy?
No.
You don't think that's what it was?
Well, that's just one building block. I mean, it's the whole, what I want to really emphasize or get across is just, this is the sweep of history moving to a pre-programmed, predetermined end point. Okay, the end was already established in the beginning. And as I described and as I drew, let's say this is the entire picture of the completed prison. The New World Order, very few individuals controlling the many to build the prison and then to eliminate 80-90% of the prison workers and keep a small coterie of slaves to, and then they just get to enjoy the world, to take it over, to steal it from us, basically. So it's already predetermined. The whole design is right here. Here's the timeline of history. Here's the beginning of time. Here's the end of time, 2012, And, they take some monoatomic gold and they find out, okay, here's a piece. Actually they see the whole thing. But here's their piece. They download it, manifest it. They keep doing it as time goes on. Occasionally a prophet goes and he sees this whole picture of what's going to happen here. And whether it's John or Nostradamus, he says, okay, this is what it's going to look like at the end. Okay? But it's all in the mind, the collective unconscious mind consciousness system pre-programmed by our friend Anu, who is basically designed this. He's got friends. I mean, partners, associates. One is called Enki, one is called Enlil, and one is called Marduk. Marduk designed the genetic physiological structure of our Earth suit, if you will. These guys played good cop, bad cop. Okay, if you read the Sumerian text, Enki is the good cop, the good brother, the nice guy. If you look at Genesis and the description of, Yahweh, Jehovah, I mean, it's obviously there's two personalities there. There's the loving, compassionate God, and there's the vengeful, wrathful God. Well, Enlil was the vengeful, wrathful God. He was the bad cop, And then Enki, that's just my brother here. You do this, this, and this, and I'll take care of you. It's just the same old story. They keep on playing over and over. And it's essentially, our friends, the two pillars, Good cop, bad cop. So you've got Anu, the puppet master. You got Marduk, the designer of the Earth suit. You've got the twin brothers, the good cop, bad cop. And you read about them, in the Sumerian text, in Sitchin and many others. And then Marduk, of course, was the name of Marduk Ra, who then stepped back into the shadows and became Amen Ra, the sun god. But Amen, as I told you yesterday, means the hidden one. Okay? So, speaking of our friend Amen Ra, or Amen Re, actually over the A, Re, which sometimes in English phonetic spelling is spelled like this. This is Re, where we get our name for king. For example, do we recognize that word? Our Spanish-speaking friend behind the pillar? Are you playing Amun-Ra, the hidden one? I can't see you. Hi, Leo. Okay, does that mean real? As in real estate? Real estate? Or does that mean rey, as in real in Espanol? Okay. El Camino Real, do we recognize that in California? It means the King's Highway. Okay. There's many spellings of this. In French, it's Roy, from which we get Royal, in English, Rey, from the ray of the sun, from Amun-Re. Real, or real estate. We call it real estate, okay? But do you know what that means when you buy real estate? Or you think you buy real estate? We're going to get into that later. You're simply a ward and servant to the royal estate, okay? You have nothing to do with ownership in that. Well, it already is the crown's. You're just volunteering to maintain it. Exactly, and pay the taxes and do the maintenance, and do your due. And when they've had enough of you, they evict you and put somebody else in to rebond and remonetize it. But that we'll get to in a little bit. But it all comes from Amun-Re. They even named a candy after him, Amun-Roca. So, back to the 1500s, we'll get back to Amun-Re and Real and real estate and all the rest of that. But back to the 1500s, 1492 into the early 1500s, you have certain things happening. Between about 1519 and 1536, all kinds of extraordinary events were taking place, rearranging the entire landscape in preparation for the end game of the next 500 years. And if we had a whole extra day, I could talk about the Mayan numerology and calendars and structure, the Central European history that put the kings and rearranged things, Henry VIII and founding of the Anglican Church and the Protestant movement and Luther. It all happened between 1519 and 1536, setting the template for the next 500 years. That if you want to study a period of history that's most fascinating, that established what we're dealing with today, I just read a book called, a great book called The Defenders of the Faith. And it's about Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, but he was Spanish, It started with Otto and Charlemagne, the Frank, and then the Germanic. It moved over to the Spanish in Charles V. He was the grandson of Isabel and Ferdinand. Luther popped up at the time, and there was fights between the Holy Roman Empire and Rome, and there was this guy named Suleiman who was the head of the Ottoman Turk Empire. And the Ottoman Empire existed as a counterforce of Islam against Europe post-Crusade period for the next 400 years until the end of World War I. World War I was primarily fought to break apart the Ottoman Empire and rearrange Europe and parts of Africa and start dividing it into these artificial structures, the whole Slavic states, the Baltic states, setting up Russia, which is basically a Slavic, royalty line and so forth, and setting things up for the 20th century to prepare us for the end point. Who here knows who Albert Pike is? Okay, Albert Pike was the 33rd degree Mason Grandmaster in America in the 1870s. And he was pulling lots of strings behind the scenes in setting everything up. And he wrote various letters and books and so forth. And in one series, he basically outlined the 3 world wars. So if you do a Google search on Albert Pike, World War III or 3 world wars, you will find a lot of very interesting things. He outlined exactly what had to be done with each of the world wars. World War I would be fought with such and such of a activation, intention, requirement, and result. That result was definitely achieved, breaking up the Ottoman Empire and otherwise. And of course, in honor of all of that, when did they formally declare the end of the war? Armistice Day, 11/11, November 11th. That is Armistice Day. You know, our friends, 11/11. Remember those guys? Probably so. And they formally signed the treaty at Versailles, which is known as the Palace of the Sun, and the crown prince of the French line of the Louis is known as the Sun King, you know, or the Dauphin, and then he becomes the Sun King. And then he described what had to happen for World War II, and it pretty much played out exactly as required. And then World War III was to be a fight between, you know, return to that fight between Charles V and Suleiman, between Christendom and Islam. And I believe we're watching it all play out today. But not quite at the level or what they expected it to be. Because as I said yesterday, the game plan has fallen apart. But back to the 1500s, one of the key things that happened was the Spanish, of course, started sending players over, and in 1519, Cortez, on a predetermined date that the Mayans knew exactly would happen, they exactly said, on this date, the gods will return. And the gods looked like white men with big beards. And he showed up exactly on that day. Why did they expect the gods to look like that? Because there's an Aztec name for what that area that we call Mexico City. Do you know what it is, my Mexican friend? Right, Tenochtitlan. Okay. Leo was born and grew up his younger years in Mexico City. Tenochtitlan. You notice anything in there? Well, Titlan means city. T is the article. Enoch City. Okay? Enoch was one of our friends setting up the biblical structures, and he also had a major role in building the Neolithic monuments, things like Stonehenge and all the other henges and other things in Western Europe and in the British Isles. I forget the name of the book, and all my books are buried in storage, but there was a series of books that I read all about what all of those Neolithic monuments were about and what the real origin was. And the fact is that that player or group of players known as Enoch did come over to Central America and initiate a lot of what then became the Mesoamerican civilizations, Aztecs, Mayans, and all the rest of it. So that was his city, Mexico City. So there were records already for hundreds and thousands of years held by the elite, the Vatican, and so forth. Just like the French noblemen who went off in 1096 on the First Crusade to go take over Jerusalem and re-access the records and the artifacts and the technology under Solomon's temple, already knew it was there. It wasn't like these things happened by accident. So they knew what they were going to find, you know, and Cortez went with that mandate. And the history of Cortez, he landed on the shore in an area near what's modern-day Veracruz, and rather than normal military tactics, you know, of taking your time and holding your positions and stuff, he just headed straight for Mexico City as if he had a map. You know, he did what he did. He conquered the Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, and Montezuma, and then he went straight up to the Four Corners area for the same reason. He knew what was there, and what was there was huge amounts of refined gold. You know, the Spanish, yes, did mine a lot of gold, but in the meantime, there was a lot more. If you look at the records in Seville of how much gold was taken out and what they were doing from the very beginning, you know, it wasn't out of their crude mining technology. It was already there. You know, that El Dorado legend of the cities of gold and so forth is not just legend. The point is, remember that I said that there is 2 places on the planet where that symbol, the swastika of the magnetic field surrounding every being, living being in the planet itself, was in southern Tibet and in the Four Corners. So they went straight up there. They knew what they were doing, and they started forcing the Indians to show them where the gold was, and then enslaving them, and then hauling massive amounts of gold out of there. The reason I'm telling you all this is because there was a guy in that process who played in a key and absolutely essential role in the history of the last 500 years. Anybody want to guess who that was?
Saint Germain.
No. Go to the back of the class. Anybody else? His name was Ignatius Loyola.
Wow.
Okay. He was a priest who was ministering to the Spanish warriors and workers and middle managers and everybody else. And he suddenly had, while he was on one of the mule trains hauling gold from the Four Corners down to this area, Corpus Christi, Galveston, the ports, to haul it back to Europe, he had this sudden enlightened event. And that was to found what became known as the Jesuit order. Okay, so to me, again, I look at timing, events, synchronicity, how it falls into place, understanding there's a pre-programmed map, and somebody's going to show up to be downloaded with the next implementation. So the fact that it happened right there in the Four Corners area with hauling all the gold out of there, and there's a whole history about that. Just briefly, I will mention that I had the opportunity to meet a very interesting individual about 11, 12 years ago. And I might come back to him a little later, or the stories of why and how we met for other things in our modern historical period. But among other things, he was involved with people who were exploring and digging out and researching a lot of these details that I'm talking about. And that's how my life has gone, how I've put all this together. Very interesting. I do a lot of reading. I've done so for the last 50 years, a lot of inner exploration, and also at the same time, since my wife and I have been together for the last 19 years, life has thrown us into some of the most interesting, unique circumstances in pursuing what we've been pursuing, to meet people who have these kernels and pieces of historical insight that I've been plugging into the puzzle. So I've just been going with the flow of life, and I keep picking up all these puzzle pieces, you know, as I described a bit yesterday. The piece that he had was describing how he and his research group, among other things, they had a technology that if you flew at a low altitude in a plane, it had the ability to pick up aggregations of refined gold. That gold, after, he said, the technology was based that after about 100 years, if you have a mass of refined gold, like pure bullion, that it emits a certain sort of frequency or subatomic level of something, a wave pattern or something that this technology was designed to pick up. And they flew from the Four Corners, which is right here, in this area, southern Utah. This is also why the Mormons came to Utah. They knew what was there, all this gold that's hidden, and still is, mostly. The Spanish found some, but most of it is still there. And of course, you know, the modern money mechanics and bankers and gold masters are desperately trying to keep the cap on the fact that gold is extremely abundant, and if it was brought out, everything that is available on the planet, everybody would be multimillionaires in just the gold alone, everyone on the planet.
I like that. I like that because that puts a lot of pieces together in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
This is why we can't take gold out of our own country.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of reasons, and we can get into that later. But the point is that the Native American nations here, just as the natives here in southern Tibet, known as the Shaolin priesthood, consider themselves the stewards and the holders of this for thousands of years. They didn't monetize it. They didn't have this, you know, fabrication in their mind. It was just protect this, you know, hold it, steward it. And so when the Spanish came here, they started pulling it out. Why? Because they knew from records from thousands of years ago that that's where you're going to find it. And so my friend Joe, who I'm talking about, and his group took this technology and they flew all over the patterns of, you know, the mule trains and how they took everything. Of course, they had mule trains, you know, like say 500 animals that could carry a maximum weight of a certain amount, you know, 50 kilos or something per animal. If an animal died, they didn't have another animal to carry it, so as they died along the trail, they had to stash it. There's huge amounts of that stashed all along that whole area. But they flew all along there. They sent teams to go to the records in Seville where the Spanish kept all their records, and they found all the records. Yes, this is where it is, this is what we did, this is what we found, et cetera, et cetera. And with that technology, they were able to pinpoint many, many places of where that is. One in particular, they decided to actually explore and dig into and see what was there. It was in southern Utah. They dug down some amount, 100 feet or whatever, several hundred feet, and they found the underground artificial cavern or rooms carved out where they found a lot of very interesting things. They found cement-like containers, like something like this big, that had hollowed out in the center, that had all these little metallic pieces of, you know, just pieces of metal with script written on it, you know, all these records, yeah, but small, but on shelves all over the place. They found lots of gold, and they found a room where there were 16 on the perimeter, circular room, tube-like tombs with human-type bodies there, and two bodies on two marble, similar to a sarcophagus kind of thing, lying on the top, perfectly preserved, with white powder everywhere. That same old white powder. And
Where was this find, may I ask him?
southeast corner of Utah.
Southeast corner?
The interesting thing, one of the guys was an artist, and he drew the rendering of the two bodies fully dressed in sort of military-like garb. One man, one woman, 8 feet tall with long red, 8 feet tall with long red hair. And Joe, my friend who was telling me this and showing my wife and I showing us this, showed us these drawings and pictures, showed me photographs of the little inscribed metal tablets or whatever. And about, I don't know, 2-3 years ago, sometimes I just get into this flow late at night for hours, just going from, as I'm sure you all do, one website to the other. And I actually found a website with those pictures posted on it. And just like that other thing that I told you yesterday about the that YouTube video of the Vatican and the Eye of Horus, I didn't mark it down, and I have no clue how to get back to it. But obviously it was posted. I've been out of touch with this man for most of the last 10 years. Tried to reach him recently, and I wasn't able to. But I'd like to find out the rest of the story. But the part of the story I do know was he said these guys were there and, looking at everything, drawing, photographing. And the thing that kind of sent them back up to the surface is when the bodies started moving. So they were preserved like in suspended animation. And whether that means they were going to get up and say, hey, what are you bugging us for? I don't know. But that's the whole of the story. But the point is there's a lot more layers of history on this planet, thousands and millions of years ago, than we possibly can imagine. Of course, has been all overlaid. One of the things in esoteric archaeology is something called ooparts. Anybody know what ooparts are? Out of place artifacts. Okay, meaning something that, according to the story of history, that we were primitive and, raised up to the modern technology, and this is the pinnacle of it. But then there's these out-of-place artifacts, things like finding in a coal mine with coal at a layer that geologically is established as being 200 million years old, finding a perfectly made 24-karat gold chain at that layer, man-made, things like that. Out-of-place artifacts, such as what I've just described. But that's just a little side vignette. The point is, our friend Ignatius Loyola had this download. This is it. Okay, I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to go found the Jesuit order. He went and talked to the Pope, and in 1536, and just the same way as the Templars went and talked to the Pope in 1128 and said, we got it, we're supposed to do this, knight us as the Templars, the order, and we're going to go create the infrastructure for the banking system. The Jesuits was founded by the order of the Jesuits being granted the same kind of privilege and level. And that has become a underpinning of the, it's basically the dark underbelly of the Catholic Church and its efforts over the last 400 to 500 years.
Yeah, I had an opportunity to read the Jesuit oath recently.
Yeah, it's not so pleasant. There's a book that is hard to find. I own a copy of it. I've read it, of course, but you can find it used. It's called The Vatican Assassins, and I do believe there's a website with some of it on it. I forget the name of the author. But it goes into the history of the Jesuits. And basically, it's pretty conclusive that virtually every war, every assassination, every major event of shifting history into the direction that it has flowed for the last 400 to 500 years has been orchestrated and or precipitated or executed by the Jesuits. Bottom line. It's no accident that this occurred in 1536. In 1540, There was something started called the Council of Trent that lasted into the early 1560s, and basically was a mapping out and the planning of how the Catholics would play the game against the Protestants and or anybody else who was a heretic, and move everything to where, because the basic goal, the New World Order, is one religion controlled by the Catholics, one state controlled by the crown, the king, so you have the line of the priest through the one religion, through the Catholic Church, the one king through the crown of England, controlled by the city of London, and the Council of Trent was basically the planning of it. The first major event that occurred in Europe out of that was what was called this 30 Days War, which is 1618 to 1648. Which was basically the Catholics against the heretics or the Protestants. And all the wars since, everything that has happened, has been basically coming out of the planning done in that period. So I'm basically just giving you the highlights and the key building blocks of modern history. Okay? And of course, the other very major and significant event, and what I mean to say, going back to that, is obviously there's no time, we could spend a week talking about the history of the Jesuits and what they did. We could talk about a week talking about the history of gold and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just giving you frameworks to build upon to get to the modern level where we're at and what we're dealing with today, within the context of the esoteric structures behind it and the basic structure that I outlined and built all of this on yesterday with the 2 pillars and everything else. So the other major, very significant event was started in the year 1636. That was the birth of a man in Central Europe called Savi Sabbatia. Savi is spelled no. Savi, or it could be Savi Sabbatia. 1636. Anybody know that name?
It's familiar, I can't place it.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure. I heard about it before, so.
Okay. He was a Jewish man born in, I'm not quite sure, one of the central states. It could have been Austria, but it doesn't really matter. And he basically proclaimed himself to be the Jewish Messiah, okay? And he gathered around him during the course of his life key players, and his basic tenet was that we are here to fulfill the covenant. Remember the covenant of Abraham, but what we're told as the covenant of Abraham on the surface is not necessarily the real covenant. The real covenant is to create basically the draconian, fascist, New World Order banking legal structure to bind the entire world's population to do what I described yesterday, to be the labor force, to harvest the wealth, to build the prison, and etc. This is the real foundation of the modern banking system. Okay, right. Okay, I just remembered that there's another key point that I forgot to mention here, another key building block before I go into Mr. Savi. There's this little group in Central Europe called the Khazars. Anybody familiar with that name?
Khazar. Yesterday you were
Right.
the root of Khazars.
Gaithars, Caesars, Khazars, yes, it's all very much the same. They controlled basically this area in here, okay, all of the trade routes between Europe and Asia. They were, basically the gatekeepers, the toll keepers. They accrued large amounts of wealth. And they decided, or the king or the leader, I believe around 700s in that area, decided en masse one day, okay, we're going to choose a religion. And they decided to choose the Jewish religion. So basically, when we talk about so-called modern Jewish control elements or the Zionist movement or all the other elements of what has become the hidden force behind the completion of, when I get back to Sabbatia, the fulfillment of the covenant, we're talking about Khazarian Jews. Okay? Most modern Jews are not of the Semitic real genetic line that existed 2,000 years ago. Okay? I was born as a Jew. And so I'm talking about the people that I grew up with in my family. We're all basically Khazarians from this whole area. You know, there's another type, and they're basically referred to as Ashkenazi. Interesting, the last four letters are N-A-Z-I, Nazi. But that's the Khazarian. There's another type of Jew called the Sephardic, that basically were in Spain, and a different racial genetic line. But the Khazarian are basically, this is the Caucasus, and so they're Caucasian, and that's your modern Jewish race, is basically Khazarian. Now, almost all Jews are just like everybody else, you know. All Catholics, or most Catholics, are just good people trying to stay alive and keep their faith and what have you, just as Protestant Christians are, just as most Jews. So this is not anything about anti-Jew, anti-Semitic, what have you. But we are going to get to the point of who are the masters of the world, or the middle management ones fulfilling the covenant, which takes us all the way back to our friend Anu. Basically they're Khazarian Jews. So back to our friend Mr. Sabbatia. He was born in 1636, and he, at some age, I don't remember exactly when, probably relatively young, he said, hey, I'm it, I'm the Messiah. I'm here for us to fulfill the covenant. And basically, his basic tenet, or philosophy, if you will, was that to fulfill the covenant, we have to reverse the law. Okay, where the law before had been, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not do this, that, and the other, we must do all those things to fulfill the law. We must kill. Therefore, it is okay for you to create a structure, to create world wars where 50 and 100 million people die. That is fulfilling the covenant that we are here to fulfill. Okay? Steal? No question about it. You know? Lie? Not a problem. There is something that takes place every year called the Kol Nidra. Anybody heard of the Kol Nidra? Yeah. K-O-L-N-I-D-R-E. It happens the day before Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. Okay? Once a year, where the Jewish faith says you can atone for your sins. Atone, which starts with Atan, our friend Atan, remember? Akhenaten? Okay. Kol Nidra means that you can, you are allowed to negate any oath or vow or pledge or contract that you may have made. In other words, you can lie and basically cross your fingers behind your back and say, yes, I will do this, or yes, I am this, or whatever the case may be. It's a rescission of oaths and vows that is allowed. So in other words, we can lie with impunity because at the end of the year we can take the Kol Nidra and negate it.
Okay.
Is that we, the Khazarian Jews?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, Khazarian Jews.
Just the Khazarians or all Jews?
Well, I basically, I don't know that I can answer that, but I would suggest, yes, any Jew can do that, but I grew up in the Jewish community. All the Jews I knew are good people, and, they're just, they have all those characteristics we know. They like to tell jokes, be sarcastic, and, and myself no exception, and, are generally going to professions and businessmen and what have you, but they're not insidious, nefarious individuals. All the Jews, or virtually all of them, most of them who were killed in World War II, World War II was orchestrated by the Khazarian Jews, no doubt. So here you have Jews orchestrating the murder of all the Jews that took place in World War II, and I'll get to that, but the essence of it was that was a setup to return to Israel to fulfill the covenant of the Zionist, as I talked about yesterday, the return to Zion and the final stage of the two pillars being merged back of the king and the priest, with the pact made with Otto the Great and the Pope for the Germanic line to be the kings and the Pope to be the priest, and they returned to Israel. So that was pre-structured, and that was right in the template Albert Pike wrote out when he said World War I, World War II, World War III. Okay. Now, World War III doesn't look like 1 and 2, but I don't think it takes a rocket science to figure out we've been in World War III for the last 10 years, I mean, yeah. Not as bad, in the outpicturing of it as World War II in that sense, but hey, we've been at war for 10 years. So it is not per se absolutely able to be documented, but the likelihood, for me, almost certainty, based on everything I've read, looked at, and again looking at how I look at history as in sort of a quantum flow of pre-established everything that I've said, that one of Sabatia's children was this man who ended up being known in history as Meyer Amstel Rothschild. Okay. So even if he wasn't the bloodline child, certainly Meyer Amstel Rothschild was definitely one of the key players of the Sabbatean covenant. Okay? And this is the basis of picking up and taking up with the Jesuits and what they were going to do within the Catholic Church, and what the Templars set up with the banking system in the House of Orange relative to the Venetian banking families to consolidate and integrate it. And so when Rothschild, for those who don't know, Meyer Amstel was the parent of the 5 boys who then became the 5 sons, his 5 sons, who went to the 5 principal capitals in Europe, including London and Vienna and Paris and Rome, and I'm not sure what the 5th one is, maybe Berlin, and established the Rothschild banking empire. And the key son being Nathan, who went to London, established N.M. Rothschild. And interestingly, of course, again, looking at the reciprocity of the energetics and the symbology, 5, that number 5, taking that pentagram of the feminine principle and turning it upside down, such as the Pentagon is a machine of absolute antithesis to the feminine principle of life, and using it as the machine of war. So you have the 5 sons going and establishing the grounding point of the Rothschild banking empire. So Meyer Amstel Rothschild, likely being the son of Sabatier, and or if not biologically the son, certainly the heir apparent to fulfill the covenant that Sabatier, and they were known as the Sabbateans. And one of the things that happened in about 1660s, 1670s, interesting, right around the time of the Great Fire of London and the establishment of the building the city of London, physically that 1 square mile area. Right. Was that Sabatier was living at some time in the Ottoman Empire amongst the Turks and in Islam, and he was brought to the head honcho at the time and basically given a choice: stop what you're doing or we'll kill you, or you can also, by stop what you're doing, also you have to convert to Islam. And he basically said no problem, and basically part of his teaching to his covenant principles was do anything as required to infiltrate, and they did. They infiltrated the Catholic Church, the Islamic system, the Western system. Every known structure was infiltrated by key Sabbatean players. And then Rothschild, concurrent with that, basically in the, I think, I'm not sure when Meyer was born, but I think he was born late 1600s. Anyways, he brought together the key 13 Khazarian families, and that's where you hear that that reference to the 13 families who controlled the world. They were 13 Jewish Khazarian families, names such as Kuhn, Loeb, Schiff, Warburg, Rothschild, and I don't know all the rest of the other names, but there were 13, and they basically got together and said, here's our game plan. We're going to infiltrate everything: media, military, government, banking, et cetera, and this is how we're going to fulfill the covenant to take over the world, to deliver it back to our master when he returns, whomever that is, whether that's Satan, Lucifer, Anu. It's really all the same. They're all the same player wearing different masks. Okay, so don't get confused by the masks. It's all the same player. And it's all ultimately holographic mind inserts into the mind consciousness system of the human collective to outpicture all of this multifaceted expression of illusion of separation and polarity and enemy construct and all the rest of it. And basically that is the rest of the next 300 and so years of history. Into the 1700s, you then have the extending out of the Rothschild banking history. I'm not going to go into that, but suffice to say that in conjunction with the Jesuit-initiated wars and assassinations and other things, systematically moving history to the point of taking complete control of all the major aspects of a global system, which the primary ones are media, military, monetary. There's 4 M's, and but I think you get the. I'll think of the other 2. But those key elements of controlling the global system. Who has heard of something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Learned Elders of Zion? Anybody not heard of that?
I have not heard of that.
Okay. Yeah, you've heard of it, or you haven't. Okay. Well, write that down. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion.
What did you say?
Learned Elders of Zion. This was something that fell out into public awareness in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Is it sign is manifestation?
Manifesto, yeah.
Oh, yes, okay, I have it.
Mayans and Hopis, is this in alignment with?
Hopi prophecy or Mayan prophecy? Well, let me finish this. I'll go back to that.
Okay, now I heard of it. It's called it's the Institution.
Protocols of Zion is, okay. If you do a Google search on that, there's a lot out there. Of course, it was debunked, and it was so-called accidentally, found when the courier got sick or in an accident or something, and then it got found and published and then debunked and et cetera, et cetera. But I personally feel like, one, it wasn't quote-unquote accidentally found. They always want these things out in the public. Remember, ultimately, that what I said is everything is hidden in plain sight. Why? Because it's we who are creating it, so that when we create something, or when it comes into our system, we induce it down to the biocrystalline virtual reality projecting units that we are, and we outpicture it. One of the ways that it manifests is by us polarizing with it, because remember, the whole thing is play black against white, get us to eat the fruit from the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, why? Because once we get into that polarization of good and evil, this end is always attached to this end. So when you move it, it moves, So when our awareness is focused through the mind consciousness system on something that we're polarized with, whatever it is, we actually help continue and maintain its manifestation. Okay, and that's the game. Get us to polarize with something and manifest it. That's why the enemy construct, or the polarity construct, is the fundamental way to create this manifested reality. So I'm going to get into later how to address that. What's our time like?
It's 10 after 11.
Okay.
11:11.
There you have it.
He manifested it.
A synchronicity.
Ken, quick question. Knights of Malta, how do they fit into it?
Well, the Knights of Malta were originally known as the Hospitallers. They were an order that during that same period when the Templars emerged, they came together, and they were, there is a very legitimate element of them that is, Knights of Mercy, hospital building, medical relief and stuff like that. But it is also a very fundamental militaristic order that has sort of a complementary aspect of, the modern Templar Masonic impetus and Jesuit to participate in their part of the puzzle and their pieces of the pie. I haven't actually really studied that much about.
And it still exists. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
so often in Germany.
Oh yeah.
It's right there.
So I haven't really studied the Knights of Malta as much as I've studied the Templars, so I don't know that much about them. But I do know that in that book that I mentioned, The Defenders of the Faith, when Suleiman was pushing up against Europe, and he actually conquered Budapest and Vienna, but he was finally pushed back at a certain point. But here's Turkey and Constantinople, wherever Constantinople is.
It's right.
Yeah, well, it's now called Istanbul, but so it's on the Black Sea. Anyways, there's an island. I forget the name of it. Anyways, there was a key island that the Knights of Malta were holding, and a fortress that really prevented the Ottomans from infiltrating into the Mediterranean. And they were under siege by Suleiman, and he did defeat them, pushed them out. They ended up going to Italy for a while, and to Rome, and finally they were given Malta as their domain. So the Sabbateans basically, as I said, infiltrated all major religions, all major systems, and essentially that was their mandate, their covenant is to use any and all means, reverse the law, use murder, stealing, war, avarice. You know, it's the same line as came out of the Hyksos to the cult of Aton, all the way through this entire sweep and flow of history in establishing what we've been going through for the last day or so. So they were the fulfillment of the endpoint, to deliver the entire prison system that we are now living in to Anu at the end of time, ostensibly in about 18 months. So now we move into the 1700s, and in 1776, a great year for certain things like the Declaration of Independence, but also there was something founded in Bavaria called the Illuminati, the modern Illuminati, by this guy named Adam Weishaupt. On anybody who doesn't know, want to guess what date?
November
11th. It's a good guess, but the wrong one.
Oh, God, May 1st.
Very good. Yeah. So on May 1st, the founding of the Illuminati.
1776, right?
Yeah, and he was an agent of our friend Mr. Rothschild. At that point, Nathan Rothschild, I believe, or one of the Rothschilds. You know, there's just layers and layers and layers of fascinating history and interweaving of all the stories, but basically the key being that the Sabbateans, the heir apparent after Sabi Sabbatia died was a man named Jacob Frank, and so they became known as the Frankists, and basically it just continued along with the Rothschild game plan to infiltrate and take over the systems of the world, primarily through the creation of the money system. And as I said, again, is it an accident that it's all about the blocking of the root chakra and the control of the electrical current? You know, that's why money is called currency. It's the flow. It's supposed to flow as electrical current, and it can be controlled by the charge and discharge, smoke and mirrors system that we have today. But so is it any accident that the Rothschild name took on that name, Red Shield? You know, it is, and it's also no accident, I was thinking that I forgot to mention yesterday, that the red carpet, who walks the red carpet? The gods, the stars, the elite, the royalty. What are they doing? They're walking on our red root chakra because they get to walk on the red chakra. And they get, yeah, they get to be the elite or the gods or the pseudo-gods who get all the glory and the illusions of wealth and so forth. But of course, as we see from history, behind it, behind the facade of wealth and lap of luxury, they're more screwed up than anybody, you know.
I would have chosen purple for the carpet.
Well, why is purple that royal color? Remember what I said? Because of the phoenix, because of the burning of the gold to create the mana, is crimson purple. Okay, so that was the sign of royalty. So purple and red were key elements. Right, purple, but the cardinals are red, right? Okay. You notice that public figures who are mind-controlled will often wear red and black. You know, also like in the story of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, you know, they gave her the ruby red slippers. They were actually originally silver, but you know, but as far as wearing red and black, you notice that Tiger Woods always wears red and black on the last day of a tournament. You know, he has definitely got some of those elements, if not completely those elements. But you're also noticing that a lot of these major players that have been programmed to play out these roles. Remember, I talked about the symbol, the golf flag, and so here's Tiger Woods. But what's happening now? They're falling from those positions. Like Rupert Murdoch is about to fall. That's based on what I'm going to tell you about a little later today. Which essentially, to give you a clue of what's coming, suffice to say that the skeletal infrastructure holding all this in place has been removed. So what we're going to be watching here is the collapse of the hologram and the collapse of the entire mind consciousness control system. And the only thing going to be left standing is those in alignment of beingness with life and oneness and balance and equality. Everybody else who is operating on the illusions of separation and greed and ego and power and control and everything I'm talking about, is imploding on itself now. Yeah. So that's the good news. The bad news is the shit is hitting the fan, and it's going to be a big mess. So make sure you always go out with your hip waders on, because we're going to be wading through it, But seriously, it's not going to be pretty. It already isn't pretty. But, from my point of view, we will get through this and we will emerge, whole on the other side once we cleanse and purge all of this. So my whole purpose really ultimately in presenting all this is not to create fascination with all of this stuff, all this history, because it is all ultimately an illusion that we've outpictured and created, the illusion of separation, the illusion of them versus us, and all the rest of it. But it's to create a framework to understand what has happened, what we have accepted, allowed collectively to arrive at this point of almost basically locking our entire beingness of the entire human race and the planet into a path of complete enslavement and perpetual self-destruction and self-abuse. So, because if we remain too fascinated on the conspiracy and the history and, them, then what do? We're just dancing the polarity, And there is a tool which I'm going to introduce to you later this afternoon of how to step above that. Okay?
I just can't wait.
Okay. So, how do you like that so far? What I meant was thanks for the appreciation, but I didn't mean that for it. How do you like what I've done so far? But more like, how does that, does it give you a wider and fuller understanding of how this whole thing has been brought to a structure? Okay.
In martial arts, we say when we get to 3rd degree or 1st degree, you're going to get hit, but at least you'll see what hit you. This is what is happening today in this room. We're going to get hit, but at least we'll see it coming. And then you've got a chance to do your move. You have options now.
So how can we be part of it, of actually making it work for all of us in a better way? That's actually my question. I want to I'm sure you elaborate on that.
Yeah, this afternoon.
Good.
Yeah,
Yes. So how can we
part of it.
be part of that?